Let's talk about getting together a depraved force of raiders, gladiators and flesh crafters with an overview of starting a Drukhari army in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Drukhari once more, and in this video I thought it was high time to update the Start Collecting Drukhari video for the 10th edition of the game. In the video we'll talk through the reasons why you might want to collect Drukhari in the first place, some of the pros and cons of the faction, some ideas for starting to plan an army and get a force together, a few ideas for first miniature purchases and what tends to work okay in game at the moment, and finish up with a few thoughts on game rules and one current strong army list. Loads to talk about for the forces of the Dark Kin, so let's jump straight into it. So why would you want to collect a Drukhari army in the first place then? In the lore, the Drukhari, aka the Dark Eldar, are essentially the Dark Elves of Warhammer 40k. They represent everything that was wrong about the Eldar before the fall, that literally birthed the god of Slaanesh into existence, a society fallen into depravity, hidden from the birth of the new warp god, deep within their webway in the nightmare city of Camorra. Their society is dominated by a splintered faction of cabals and warring gangs, often fighting against each other for territory and spoils within the Dark City, and when they make war with the other races, it's often with the goal of stealing, taking resources from planets that don't have the defences to repel them, and capturing slaves to feast off their pain and souls, or to die gruesome deaths in the gladiatorial arenas for the amusement of the Dark Kin. When they make these great raids, it tends to be on the back of their skimmer transports, iconically the Raider, striking with a speed and ferocity perhaps even above their craft-world kin, and making great use of brutal poison weapons and dark lances, often highly advanced technology compared with the races that they prey on. Between all that, I feel like Drukhari are pretty much in the running for one of the genuinely most evil factions of all of 40k, and perhaps are among the worst enemies to have overrunning your world. Miniatures-wise, the Drukhari are served by a perhaps small to medium-sized range compared with other armies in Warhammer 40k. They do have multiple choices for most battlefield roles, and I think that most people generally find their miniatures quite nice looking. Most of their sculpts come from around about 10 to 15 years ago now, though I'd say compared with quite a lot of factions they've aged really quite well, and still look pretty striking and dynamic on the tabletop. They are well known for being fairly flimsy and pointy, maybe not the easiest army to transport around. Might be worth having a good think about transport solutions from getting your army from A to B without breaking it too much. At the moment, perhaps the biggest downside of their range is that a good chunk of it was made of resin finecast type models, and this was all range rotated, temporarily out of production, and probably will remain so outside of some limited runs or maybe waiting for updated plastic kits. Units like Grotesque and Mandrakes and things are kind of annoying not to be able to buy an actual plastic kit for, and it feels like the Drukhari are waiting for a model release just to get them back to the current amount of miniatures they should have in their army. Focusing on their plastic range though, here's their unit of Cabalite warriors, perhaps the most basic troops for the faction. They're equipped with poison splinter rifles. They often make war mounted in the transport skimmer skiff that is the Raider, blades and chain snares trailing from it to ensnare the enemy. For other warriors of the faction, here are the fast and brutal witch colts armed with their gladiatorial melee weapons. There's a Talos pain engine in the centre there, a gruesome construction created by the homunculus to harvest flesh for their crafts, a razor-wing jet fighter on the top right, and an elite incubi clavex on the bottom right, elite bodyguards of the Archons with their power blades. Much of the Drukhari range is split into three major devotions: the Cabalite Raiders, the Witch Cult gladiatorial style units, and the homunculus flesh crafters. Here are a couple more examples of the latter: the basic troops of the homunculus covens and the Rax on the left here, and then we have the Helions and Lilith Hesperax, two more units fielded by the Witch Cults. Pricing wise, the Drukhari are maybe slightly on the upper end of Warhammer 40k, generally kind of having medium to elite infantry, meaning that you might need a few more models on the table compared with things like Space Marines, and often armies that rely heavily on transports tend to cost a bit more, due to them not costing all that many points in game. I would say that their Combat Patrol box set is ranked among the best of them out of 40k in general opinion. Getting multiple big skimmers in that really does add quite a lot, and that does get you a fair amount of points in game, as well as some other core choices for the faction. Finally, for gameplay, the general theme of Drukhari tends to be fast-moving, hard-hitting, but usually fairly fragile for the enemy unit punching back at them, maybe with the exception of the homunculus coven units that tend to be made of slightly sturdier stuff. Their most iconic playstyle tends to be around armies fighting from transports like the Raiders and Venoms, elite infantry jumping out of those to hit the enemy hard. though they do have plenty of supporting miniatures. The rules for the armies are a bit split between the Cabals, Cults and Covens. Things like stratagems and HQ support will be kind of locked in within each one of those, and their faction rule is power from pain. The idea that you can either slay enemy units or cause battle shock tests to gain pain tokens, and then those are handed out to your army to get plugged in to get extra damage or extra movement, which is fairly fun and evocative, getting kills and then feasting off the misery of others to inflict more damage. Currently, they maybe aren't in the most ideal place in the world in Warhammer 40k. Their internal army balance seems to be very heavily skewed towards ranged units and particularly using their Dark Light Dark Lances to kill enemy tanks, and they are perhaps one of the single weakest armies in Warhammer 40k at time of recording, just not really a lot of power to make up for their downsides, particularly for their melee units. Though I probably wouldn't get too hung up on that. It should mean that they're first in line for power improvements when Games Workshop looks at them next. Hopefully they'll be shown some love in the next balanced data slate. Overall though, if you want a fast-moving force of Dark Elves in space, moving towards the enemy at breakneck speed and hitting very hard with high-tech weaponry, then the Drukhari might be the force for you. If you do go down to choose Drukhari as your army, there's plenty of places that you can find out a bit more information about them. Index Drukhari, as mentioned, is a pretty reasonable place to start. That'll allow you to understand the units that they can take and their rules in-game. That's freely downloadable from Games Workshop's Warhammer 40k download section at the moment. Otherwise, you can mess around with some army lists with things like Battlescribe, New Recruit or Warhapedia or Games Workshop's app. You can maybe try out some test games, either with proxying some models with all of that, or maybe using Tabletop Simulator if you tend to use that. And there's absolutely tons of content here on YouTube. I've made a Drukhari index overview in the past, but there's battle reports, painting guides, and all sorts of lore on other channels. I'd recommend checking out Scarredcast for a channel thoroughly devoted to Drukhari. Really good content for all-round collecting the faction, plus examples of them being run and doing well at the highest level. Otherwise, can always be good to check out social media things as well. Discords, Facebook pages, and subreddits for the Drukhari can be good to check out, just imbibing a bit of content that other people are talking about and asking basic questions. You can definitely learn a lot just by other topics of discussion that come up. After getting a bit more of an idea of the faction, it's probably a good idea to have a think about what sort of army you'd ideally like to wind up with, at least from first impressions and what you're interested in. You could plan an 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list, just as a rough goal for what you might want to wind up with. Lots of people like to collect a fairly balanced army, just made up of the units that they either find most fun in game or just cool models in general. Though there are all sorts of ways that you could wind up with a slightly different collection if you wanted to. You could go heavy on either range or melee, going big on poison weapons and dark lances, or lean into witch cult units fighting in combat. As mentioned, range tends to be a bit better at the moment, though there's every chance that could change with future balance passes or rules updates. You could potentially build really heavily into one of the three sub-factions, the Cabal Forces, the Witch Cults, or the Homunculus Covens. Again, no real disadvantage to having a mix of the few unless you want to go purely down lore theme. I've certainly seen army lists in the past that really skewed to one of the three, maybe most commonly things like mass spam of pain engines from the Coven side of things, playing Drukhari of a bit of more of a slow and purposeful flavour. Otherwise, you could have a read of the lore and build around a certain Cabal, Witch Cult, or Homunculus Coven out of the actual official lore, or come up with your own. There's a fair bit of inspiration out there. Just for a little of that, here are 3 examples of various Cabals of the Drukhari. The Cabal of the Flayed Skull rule a great spire within Komorrah, have a big emphasis on aircraft and skimmers within their ranks, perhaps even more so than the rest, and true to their name, have an unpleasant habit of flaying the heads of their enemies after they've killed them. Otherwise, the Poisoned Tongue perhaps unsurprisingly go in for toxins and venoms, developing metallotoxins to burn through armoured units just as their venoms will happily kill any infantry and bioforms out there. And the Cabal of the Black Heart are perhaps the biggest and baddest out of any in Drukhari, ruled over by the legendary and reclusive Astrobel Vex. These are perhaps the single Cabal that you really can't afford to be on the wrong side of in the Dark City. The Witch Cults and the Homunculus Covens also have their own characters and lore backstory. If you wanted to read a bit more about them, you could pick up a previous copy of the Drukhari Codex. They tend to have some lore sections on a few of the major sub-factions, as well as just the army in general. Otherwise, for planning an army, you could think about painting up a test model to work out a colour scheme. I think my first choice if you're going for more standard Drukhari would be a Cabalite Warrior. They're the basic troops choice for the faction, and they come in the Combat Patrol set and have a few elements that's going to be common to other infantry units throughout the army, so maybe a good place to start on something a little bit less critical than a big HQ or a transport. There's really quite a lot of ways that you can paint Drukhari miniatures. Games Workshop often tend to use ones that have black panels and then highlight the edges of those with various different colours, often green for the Cabal of the Black Heart, though there's no reason that you'd necessarily have to follow that yourself. The Raiders and Ravagers can perhaps take a bit longer to paint compared with standard infantry. They do have quite a lot of surfaces and spindly bits that can take a bit longer than some other vehicles for factions like chunky tanks. Talking of miniatures though, let's talk about first purchases for them as perhaps the most exciting thing, unless you're going for something very out there like collecting a pure homunculus Coven's army. Perhaps some of the most obvious things to start with would either be the Combat Patrol box set, but if you don't want to commit quite that much at the moment, maybe a single box set of basic troops like Cavalite Warriors or whichever other one takes your fancy could be another good way to go. Focusing on that Combat Patrol box set for Drukhari, it is a rather good one in my opinion. In the box set you get the Archon, the Cavalite leader for the faction, 5 Incubi with their big clave weapons, 10 Cavalite warriors, and then 1 Raider and 1 Ravager, the Ravager being the upgunned version of the Raider that focuses more on shooting than transport. The box set is £95, €125 or $160 and does give you a reasonable enough discount on buying separately at around about 40%. As mentioned earlier, I do think that this one is one of the better Combat Patrol box sets for Warhammer 40k out there. It gives you a fairly chunky 470 points in the box, and it does feel like it's got a very good weight of plastic to it between those 2 good-sized skimmers. This one's easily a box set that you could get more than one of if you wanted. Pretty much everything besides the Archon has good arguments to run it in multiples. Cabalites and Raiders are efficient enough and often get used for claiming objectives. Ravagers are really efficient fire support. The Incubi are maybe a bit underpowered at the moment, but as mentioned, that's not necessarily the case after balance changes that'll happen in the future. If I were to start Drukhari, this would certainly be the first box set that I'd pick up. Just in general, I think it's worth mentioning the ways that you can buy Warhammer 40k miniatures out there. It might be old news to some, but for players getting into the game, then it's well worth being aware of the other ways that you can get things cheaper. Direct from Games Workshop tends to be the most reliable, but also the most expensive, and for most people around the world, I generally recommend buying through local gaming stores, often giving you reasonable discounts on Warhammer 40k miniatures, usually somewhere between the 10 to 20% discount sort of mark. I have a whole bunch of them linked in the video description below. There's Element Games in the UK, usually 15% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off plus their store credit system, or Gap Games in Australia for 20% off. Amazon can be one of the easier ways within the USA. Not quite as generous discounts, but at least they ship all around the country. Otherwise, secondhand can certainly be a legitimate way to save a whole bunch of money. Worth checking things out on eBay if you've got a good local market for that, or other players reselling their collections in local shops. Obviously, quality is going to be a lot more variable with other people's miniatures. I would slightly beware that a badly treated Drukhari collection could have lost a whole load of the spiny bits and details. It could easily have some fairly nasty damage to fragile miniatures, either in the other person transporting them or shipping to you. Otherwise, you can also check out third-party manufacturers and the various different people who make 3D printed miniatures. Lots of great alternative sculpts exist for most Warhammer 40k factions. There are at least some out there that I've seen for the Drukhari. Can be handy enough for getting certain parts and weapons on the table, or entire 3D printed proxy miniatures that are legally distinct from Games Workshop's own things. Otherwise, beyond the Combat Patrol box set, the Cavalite Warriors kit might be another reasonable enough way to start. £27.50, $45 or €35 if you didn't want to commit to quite such a big box. Nice enough miniatures in my opinion. At the moment it makes sense to basically assemble them with all the special weapons that you can build up, dark lances, splinter cannons, blasters and the like, as they no longer cost any points in game. In general, they consider a solid enough core to the army in Raiders or Venoms, and have that nice sticky objectives type rule that can help you with point scoring. For a basic troops type unit, their damage output isn't awful as well, due to those hard hitting special weapons in the squad. If you're lucky in local gaming stores, you might occasionally find some of the previous discount sets for Drukhari, though I probably wouldn't hold my breath on those. There's a whole bunch of stuff that Games Workshop has had in production in the not too distant history, but have generally tended to sell out in most official places. You might just occasionally see them either pop up online or in local stores, though they're perhaps only really all that exciting if you can find them at some sort of semblance of their initial price. The Drukhari have had a couple of Versus sets, such as the Blood of the Phoenix one, where they had the new Drazar and Incubi, or the Piety and Pain one where they had Drukhari versus Sisters with Lilith Hesperax. Both of those could be potential options. Otherwise, for some smaller and fully focused Drukhari kits, they had a boarding patrol in mid-2023. That was a witch cult focused one with 2 units of witches, a succubus and a squad of incubi, and the old start collecting box for Drukhari that predated the combat patrol again was more witch themed, which is a Venom, Lilith and a squad of Reaver jet bikes. Otherwise, I think it is worth noting the miniatures that are out of production for the Drukhari. Games Workshop previously had a fair few more kits for them, particularly Grotesques, Urian Rakarth, Mandrakes, the Court of the Archon, and the Beastmaster and Beast packs, all of which are active units within Index Drukhari at the moment, but none of which you can actually buy through Games Workshop's web store in an official capacity. To be honest, I would say that for most of these, the loss wasn't enormous when they pulled these. The vast majority of these kits just weren't really fit for purpose in one way or another. Grotesques were hideously priced and only came with boxes of one in just one sculpt, which was kind of rubbish. I have seen plenty of people converting those out of Skaven Storm Fiends. With some head swaps and blades added, they can look really quite appropriate. Urian Rakarth is a bit of a shame, as he is one of the only unique special characters. Hopefully we see a remade model of him, but I guess it's converting him until then. Mandrakes were kind of known for warping issues with the resin on those thin blades that they had. There is rumours that they're going to be coming out in a Kill Team box set in the not too distant future, so hopefully Games Workshop will rectify that. And otherwise, the Court of the Archon and the Beastmaster and Beast packs, they were sold in individual models and just added up to a ridiculous amount of cost if you wanted a full unit of them. Honestly, for these ones, I just get a bit creative and kit bash either some alien mercenaries to guard your Archon models, or get all manner of strange alien fauna together for representing the beast packs of different sizes. There's various swarms that you could use for 40k, or things like Fenrisian wolves or flesh hounds that could work well enough for the Chimerae. Never mind just fantasy type miniatures from other systems. Overall, it is kind of annoying that these are all out of production at the moment. I feel like though, with this being such a gaping hole in the Drukhari range, Games Workshop might actually step up and try and fill in some of the gaps next time they have a codex release. So with a bit of luck, at least a few of these might get some new plastic. Otherwise though, once you've got a small core of a Drukhari army established and you can get some games in, there's a few ways that you could think about expanding the army, either going down one of the lore type themes as we talked about before, or you could try and go for the units that are a bit more useful in game at the moment. As usual in Warhammer 40k, rules and things do change fairly frequently, particularly with Games Workshop's balance passes. So there is a pretty good argument for just collecting what you like and having a fair representation of a lot of the faction. That means in whatever form gets good, at least you'll have some interesting stuff to put on the table. That being said though, currently for Drukhari, basically anything with a Dark Lance tends to be fairly good. Ravagers with Dark Lancers, the Void Raven Bomber, Scourges with their move shoot move. Kind of hard to go too far wrong with that. Raiders or Venoms with Cabalite Warriors or Racks in to take objectives are reasonable enough. Both the Telos and the Kronos Pain engines are fairly efficient for the cost, and they're often used in more competitive lists for a bit of a mainline damage dealing for the army. Mandrakes are pretty nice for infiltration and secondary objective support with their ability to phase off the table. And for HQ choices at the moment, people don't tend to be too excited by a lot of the Drukhari ones, unfortunately. Perhaps the single most common choice in the character section is just a single Archon with his Stratagem debuff, and his rerolls for his unit aren't terrible either. I say that plenty more than that is pretty usable at a more casual level. As mentioned though, Drukhari are kind of waiting on balance updates, as they do tend to struggle quite a lot at the hardest competitive levels. In any case, if I were getting going at the moment, I'd have a rough idea for an 1000 or 2000 point list to work towards, get units in small chunks, paint them up, play games and get experience, and don't be afraid to adapt and change plans as you go along when you learn a bit more about the army and what works and what doesn't. Finally, for rules and an example army list for the army, the rules are found in Index Drukhari, which is downloadable at the time from Warhammer Community, or you could pick up their index cards if you want a more tactile visual reference. The 10th edition codex for Drukhari isn't really expected out too soon at the moment. We know it's not at least until autumn 2024 at the earliest, and it could be later than this. The main thing that this should bring to the army are more detachments, so different ways to play. I feel like some of them are going to focus pretty heavily around their major themes, maybe one for Cabals, one for Covens, and one for Cults, in addition to their combined arms real space raids. Hopefully they'll reimagine a few datasheets as well. I feel like a lot of Drukhari players would quite happily see some of their stat lines and units changed around. I'd certainly not just wait for the Drukhari Codex to get started and get collecting though. Far better to have a lot of experience with the faction and a good chunk of an army together by the time that it comes out, as opposed to be starting from scratch. Currently their main faction mechanic is Power from Pain. You generate pain tokens from either slaying enemy units or making them fail battle shock, and then at the start of the phase you get to empower certain units, typically giving them full rerolls to hit at range or in melee, or potentially giving them things like reroll charges if there's going to be a key one. In general, I'd feel like the damage boosts tend to be the most effective, and some units can manipulate them, such as the Archon, to make the rerolls to hit better, or maybe things like the Warlord trait that allows you to get an extra pain token. It can maybe be a bit snowbally as a mechanic though. Certain armies might give up some kills really quite easily and allow you to empower units for more. Some armies might have just a few really big tough things that you're not going to be able to bring down very easily. Otherwise, for their faction rules, their detachment rule grants you a few extra pain tokens depending on taking a few HQs. In general, that's considered one of the very weakest detachment rules in 40k currently. Just a bit bland and doesn't really seem to be enough to get people to run one of each every game. Otherwise, for stratagems, I feel like perhaps particularly good value is insensible to pain for -1 to wound on homunculus coven units. That makes pain engines very tough for the enemy to kill. And then move, shoot, move ability can get you some big movement across the board, though it does come at a CP cost. Otherwise, for enhancements, the Art of Pain to just generate extra pain tokens is reasonable enough if you've got an HQ that's going to be sat on the board somewhere. And Labyrinthine Cunning can allow you to farm some command points for the Archon's own units, which maybe is alright to up the value of using their unit as a target for a stratagem, maybe not super outstanding still though. Finally, just to round things off, here's one example of a competitive Drukhari army list at the moment, just showcasing a few of the best things for the army right now, though there's definitely different ways that you can build around things. This one was run by George McCullough, who used it to place high at a tournament called Cross Swords War at the Westwood. Always impressive to see people doing well with Drukhari at tournaments, given that they are a faction with challenges at the moment. Perhaps the most standout feature of the army is that it's fairly Covens heavy, going very heavy on the Drukhari pain engines, 3 individual Kronos that are just very tanky for the cost, and then 3 units of 2 Talos with Gauntlet, Haywire, and Liquefy guns. Not too bad as a battle line to slog up to the midfield and fight against enemies trying to take the midfield points. They're supported by some Rax and Urian Rakarth riding to war in some of the transports, the Raider and 2 Venoms. There's 2 units of 10 Kabbalite Warriors going for the maximum amount of special weapons, 2 units of 5 Mandrakes to phase in and out and infiltrate up the board, good for secondary objectives or just putting some presence on the midfield points early on. 2 sets of Scourges with their move, shoot, move and dart lance firepower. They can appear, shoot something and then hide again. And then just in case that wasn't enough anti-tank lances, there's 2 units of Ravagers with dart lances as well. Pretty brutally efficient anti-tank there. Definitely looks like it's a pretty efficient and scary Drukhari list right now. Though obviously player skill will be a big factor as to why this did so well. Fast and fragile armies tend to require just a little bit more thinking than maybe big slow tanky ones in Warhammer 40k. In any case, hopefully that's been at least a little bit of inspiration as to collecting Drukhari in 10th edition. Feel free to share any hints or tips for playing or collecting the faction that you've come across down in the comments below. I'll leave a link to my review of Index Drukhari down in the video description as well if you'd like to watch something else for the Darkkin. That shares a few thoughts on all the stratagems, enhancements and units in the Index, plus a few more thoughts beyond that. In any case, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I've certainly made other start collecting videos for plenty of other factions in the game recently, and I'm sure we'll cycle back to Drukhari in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.